Hello, you are listening to an episode of Trade Talks, a podcast about the economics of trade policy. I am Soumaya Keynes, economics and trade correspondent for The Economist in London.
And I'm Chad Bown, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington.
This week, we are going to talk about solar panels. Why, you ask? Well, they are a source of green energy, so they're going to help prevent us all from sizzling to a crisp. But, and this is why Chad is interested, they are a subject of a trade dispute slowly working its way to President Donald Trump's inbox. It looks like tariffs are coming.
Believe it or not, we're actually also going to try to make this episode a little bit less U.S. focused. So not just talking about Donald Trump. We're going to talk about Chinese overcapacity, what the Europeans have been doing on solar panels, and why it is that countries just keep fighting over these types of products.
We'll also chat briefly at the end about how Chad thinks we should fix things. I have a sneaking suspicion that it will involve some kind of sappy multilateral option where everyone just agrees to play along nicely. But don't worry, in the meantime, I promise I will keep things interesting. But first, a message from our sponsors.
I'm Fred Bast. I'm the CEO of Candlesticks with a Z, and I need your help. My company is suffering. An unscrupulous competitor is flooding our market with unfairly low prices. My candle makers may have to lose their jobs. What can you do to help? Write to your representatives. We need a law to shut all windows, blinds, shutters, holes and chinks. Only then can we, Candlesticks with a Z, generate the jobs that this country deserves. The sun must be stopped.
That was actually a jazzed up version of an open letter Frederic Bastiat wrote to the French Parliament in 1845. He was parodying the protectionist policies of the time. He was saying that protection would be amazing for the French candle industry. Just think about all the jobs that would be created. Instead of getting their light for free from the sun, they had to buy candles instead. Obviously, this was a joke. Clearly, shutting all windows would be awesome for the candlestick makers, but it would be pretty bad for the people who suddenly had to buy them. There are some parallels with this much more modern case, except this one isn't a joke. Chad, what is going on?
So what we've got are two American companies that make solar cells. They manufacture these things. They're claiming that they've been injured by the imports coming in and they want them stopped. On September 22nd, the American agency that investigates whether that injury has happened made a determination. They ruled in favor of those two companies, basically saying, yes, they've been injured. Now, what we're waiting for is what happens next. The ball is now in President Trump's court, and he makes the decision of whether to give trade protection to these companies, and if so, what it's going to look like.
So these two companies have asked for import protection, and it looks like it is coming. Okay, that is why you are interested. You love a good trade remedy. But these cases are always way more interesting than that. So I will explain. So in the past decade or two, solar panels have become a really, really big thing. It's a relatively recent change. There was this pull factor that came from Germany in the 2000s. So this one country decided that it would start offering huge subsidies for renewable energy. They had this system where if just normal people bought a ton of solar panels, then the German government would pay them for excess electricity that they produced with these panels. And that was for various reasons. There were broader concerns about climate change. At one point, there was a Green Party as part of their government. In 2011, the Fukushima disaster made them, think twice about nuclear energy. But essentially, in Europe, you have a lot of governments that start pumping in subsidies and buying, offering money to buy solar panels. At the same time, you've got China, which decides that as part of its economic strategy, it's going to start investing in solar. And when China starts investing in something, it goes big. Huge capacity in solar panels, which it then starts selling abroad. Okay, so you've got demand from Europe, huge supply from China. You've also got amazing technological progress. So there's this thing called Swanson's law in the solar industry, which says that, roughly speaking, if global manufacturing capacity doubles, then the cost of the solar cells to get a certain amount of power falls by 20%. So as capacity is going up, the cost of these things is just collapsing. Just to give you a sense of scale, in 1977, it cost around $77 per watt, but that fell to 74 cents. In 2013. That's according to stats by Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
And so even on the American side here, too, we've got the same sorts of things happening. The American government has been very generous in terms of offering tax credits, consumer incentives, and other types of subsidies for trying to encourage renewable energies like solar. But this combined with the technological innovations, the huge amount of increased imports, especially from China, has really meant that the price and the cost of installing solar panels has plummeted. And in the United States, the way they refer to this is grid parity. Once the price falls low enough so that it's roughly comparable to the other forms of energy, natural gas, wind, etc., then even the big utility companies will start employing it.
Okay, so all this is to say that over this period of time, you have cheap electricity powered by the sun, technological change. You're helping to combat global warming. These are green energy policies. This sounds great. So, Chad, who is unhappy about this all?
Okay, so here's where it starts to get a little bit complicated. So the solar industry is not only just made up of these companies, these two companies that make the solar panels in the United States. There's more. To understand this, let's think about this through the lens of what the trade geeks like to call supply chains, trade geek speak. So we've got different companies out there. Some companies make what are called wafers. And so this is kind of the thin paper-like basic input into a solar panels. You add that together with stuff, and then you make solar cells. And then you add more stuff to that, combine it with some wiring into what are called solar modules or panels. And that's the kind of thing that you either stick on the roof of your home or that you install into these big utility projects. So the bit that China dominates in this market is the first couple of things, the wafers and the solar cells. That's the very first stage of the process. But what they've had is so much capacity that they're increasingly competing with companies in the United States, in Europe, and making it very difficult for them. And of course, the companies don't like that. The Americans and the Europeans don't like that.
Well, the American and European companies that are directly competing with these low-stage manufacturers don't like that.
That's right. So there's also a question, though, of the form that the subsidies were taking, especially the European subsidies. So the German subsidies were consumption subsidies in the sense that it didn't matter from whom that the German consumers were actually buying their solar panels. And so they tended to buy a lot of these very cheap solar panels from China, and that led to a lot of imports.
And I guess if you're a policymaker in Germany, you're like, hey, why is all our money going to these Chinese producers like that? I guess I can see why the political economy of that might not be so easy. Okay, so there's this tension, competition. I think I can smell some trade remedies.
Right. Around 2009, 2010, in the United States, the imports, especially from China, really start coming in. So in 2011, a company called Solar World, and this was an American subsidiary of the big German headquartered Solar World company, filed a anti-dumping countervailing duty case against China, saying, hey, these imports of solar panels are coming in, they're unfair, they're priced too low, they've been subsidized by the Chinese government, so we need to impose duties and to stop them. So they did. Then they had a second round of cases against China in 2014, and basically the imports from China stopped growing. They basically just flattened out. But that doesn't stop China. So China begins to sell more of these products like the wafers and the solar cells, the earlier ones in the supply chains, to other countries, Malaysia, South Korea, and they get assembled into the solar panels, and those products get exported into the United States. And so the United States continues to see lots and lots of imports of these things just from different countries. This is what trade economists call trade diversion, imports just coming in from a different source when the first country is hit with import tariffs. Now, across the Atlantic, in 2012, essentially the same thing is happening. So you've got the European Union that is imposing import restrictions through an anti-dumping case against China at basically the same time. Of course, that's not the end of the story. China is not happy that they're facing anti-dumping import restrictions from both the United States and the European Union. So what do? They retaliate. How do they retaliate? They retaliate by not buying the key input that you need to use to make these things called wafers, and that's called polysilicon. So there's a tit-for-tat little mini trade war really brewing in this industry dating back even 5 years.
I'd like to just tell listeners that Chad sent me a video on how solar cells were made. So, there's been a lot of in-depth research.
I'll post that video on our Twitter feed just so everybody can see just how solar panels are made.
Yeah. Or not. Maybe you don't have to watch that. Okay, all right. So all these trade spats. Of the two cases, the US-China case and the EU-China case, the European one was actually much bigger. At its kind of peak, it was about 22 billion euros of exports into the EU. That's about 7% of Chinese exports to the EU. It was a huge, huge deal, and it was by far the biggest case that the EU had ever filed. And because it was so big, it made it political. I know, in earlier episodes, we've been talking about how, the rules-based system is a great thing. But in this case, it became such a big deal and it was so political, they just really needed to fix it, and they reached a deal. So essentially, Chinese companies agreed to quantity limits and a minimum import price. So how that works is that if they sold below the price, then there would just be a tariff topping up to that price. The Chinese quite liked this, right? They saw it as a win-win, whereas they tend to see duties and tariffs as a loss. But you did see similar problems to the ones that you saw with the anti-dumping duties. So some firms started dropping out. They just started shipping from other countries, maybe cheating. Over the time, the deal became less effective. So essentially in both cases, whatever they tried to do with the EU and with the US, they tried to stop imports of solar panels. But as we know, trade is like water. So the imports just popped up from elsewhere. Chad, at this point, we can stop talking about the history and I will allow you to talk about what is happening now. So these two companies have asked for import protection, and this is extra to the anti-dumping, countervailing duties that already apply to these solar panels, but those ones are more specific. What is different about this new one?
Okay, so this law that these companies have come forward to use is a safeguard law. In the United States, it's Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974. And what this law does is it allows these companies to ask for much broader import protection than anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Anti-dumping and countervailing duties is country-specific. The ones that are on solar panels are only applying right now to China and Taiwan. This thing, if President Trump grants it, would potentially apply to imports coming in from all sources. So this whack-a-mole problem that we've been talking about, you stop the imports from China from coming in and they start to come in instead from Malaysia, South Korea, that would address that in particular. And this is a lot of imports now in the U.S. case as well. It's a very big case. So the United States in 2016 is importing about $8 billion a year worth of these solar products from lots of different countries around the world.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of laws on this podcast. Why haven't we talked about the Section 201?
This is another one of these laws that we haven't seen used in a really long time in the United States. So the last time it was actually triggered was way back in 2001, a case about steel. Part of the reason for that is it's harder to get import protection under this law. The proof that you have to give if you're a company about being injured, there's a higher threshold in legal speak for what injury means under this law compared to the anti-dumping and the countervailing duties. But the other part of this is, at least in the U.S. case of using this law, it's not just a bureaucratic decision. At the end of the investigation, even if the government agency that does the investigation finds injury, it's still up to President Trump in this case, to decide whether or not to impose protection. And previous presidents may have been hesitant to impose protection, and companies may have chosen not to therefore ask for it. And so that's why we haven't seen a lot of this law being used historically.
Yeah, there are a bunch of cases, I think, where a company did file and then the administration just said, no, we're not going to do it because this tariff or whatever would have more costs than benefits. Okay. But in this case, this has come up. These two companies have taken out the case. The US trade bureaucracy has found that they've been injured. And now Trump gets the opportunity to impose trade restrictions. What is next?
Well, there have been press reports over the last months that President Trump wants somebody to bring him some tariffs. Here's the possibility that he could actually impose tariffs. So in this particular case, the law says that he could impose a tariff that's 50 percentage points higher than what's currently offered, and that's 0. So he could raise the tariff on solar panels to 50%. He could impose quantitative restrictions or quotas if he wanted to. He could ask for, just like the Europeans did, countries to engage in these sort of voluntary export restraints to stop shipping. Or he could surprise us and say, you know what, we're not going to offer any import protection at all. He could do something else and say trade adjustment assistance and help workers, or just decline it altogether.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that last one happening. Okay, but even if we can't say what exactly the import restriction would be, let's talk about the general effects of it on the American solar industry. What would restrictions do?
Right. So I guess the first thing we have to remember as economists that any kinds of trade restrictions are going to create some distortions. And so let's figure out what those are going to be. So one important one is there's actual other companies out there in the American industry that make different types of solar products that aren't covered in this case that actually would stand to benefit from the trade restrictions because they wouldn't face competition anymore. They make a product called thin film.
So I guess what the tariff would do is it would make the solar things more expensive and people would just switch. People would substitute towards the now relatively cheaper product.
That's exactly right. So that's one thing that could happen. Stepping back, though, within the solar industry, there's actually a lot more jobs in doing the other stuff compared to actually the manufacturing of the wafers and the solar cells and those types of things. Putting the modules together has a lot of jobs, but even beyond that, where most of the jobs are in the installation, the distribution, the putting the solar panels on the roofs of homes or building them out into these utilities. So there's a nonprofit group called the Solar Foundation that's not at all involved in this case, and they put together data each year on employment in the industry. And their estimates are that 85% of the workers in this industry are not in the manufacturing of solar, but they're in the other stuff, in the distribution and the services. And those are the jobs that are potentially at risk.
So Fred Bass, the kind sponsor of this episode, he's saying that when he wants to shut off the sun, that the producers of candles matter more than the consumers of candles. And in this case, in the solar industry, the consumers of solar panels are also the companies, assembling the solar panels, installing the solar panels. There are many, many more jobs at risk. And also, obviously, the people buying the solar panels are going to be pretty upset as well. And I should mention that aside from the two companies that took out the case, the rest of the solar industry is not happy about this request for protection. They've been fighting pretty vocally against it. I get a bunch of trade newsletters and there's adverts from the solar industry in every single one. It's really extreme.
That's right. And it even goes beyond that. Even if we move off of the issue of jobs, another concern is of people actually switching away from using solar panels and starting to move toward dirtier forms of energy. That kind of thing obviously isn't good either, right? So the big concern is that the next generation of these major utility projects for generating energy are just going to give up on solar and turn to something else altogether.
I think at this point I should return quickly to the approach of the Europeans. Because as the US has been kind of moving this direction towards ramping up trade protection, the EU has actually been moving towards taking theirs down. So just a few weeks ago, the European Commission agreed to lower its minimum price. Partly that was in recognition that trade wasn't really being stopped by the deal. Chinese exporters were just circumventing it. But it was also in recognition of the people using the solar panels. But all that said, I guess in the eyes of the Americans, this is unfair trade. They see the Chinese subsidizing the solar industry, and that's unfair competition. Chad, what is the solution? What needs to happen to end the Star Wars?
Loyal listeners will remember that not too long ago in an earlier episode, we talked about other industries in China that had overcapacity problems. Steel and aluminum were the examples talking about then. Here it's a similar case with solar panels. But what's different in the solar panel case is there's probably a legitimate argument for why that would be okay, in the sense that there's an actual bigger societal benefit for using renewable energies rather than coal, rather than oil, that the private market just doesn't take into account. Now, as economists, we refer to these things as positive externalities. So switching to cleaner forms of energy generate benefits that move beyond the market, but that actually have bigger benefits to society. The problem is, though, the international rules don't recognize this. They don't recognize that it should be okay for China, or any country really, to subsidize solar cell production. So what the United States is doing, countervailing duties, what the Europeans are doing, is actually legal under the international rules, and that's a bit of a problem. So my concern is that the rules are part of the problem here. What we really need is a multilateral deal.
I should note that at this point I'm just looking at Chad on the Skype link, looking really, weary.
So what we really need is a bigger environmental goods agreement that would have rules that would explicitly allow for subsidies in these types of clean, renewable energies. Subsidies, but also to create rules that would limit those subsidies, to create a level playing field. The problem is it's not just limited to solar. We're seeing this same battle, subsidies, countervailing duties, tariffs, trade restrictions, play out in other clean energy products as well. Wind towers is a second example. To my mind, we just need better rules and a set of cooperative negotiations to really get at the heart of this underlying problem.
Surprise, surprise. In summary, we need less fighting over solar panel subsidies and more multilateral agreements. Good luck with that. I think that is all for this week's episode of Trade Talks. If this has sparked your interest, then watch out for rulings on the case. On November 13th, the International Trade Commission has to recommend to Trump what it thinks he should do. Then, the president has to make a decision by January 12th. We'll be watching closely. Finally, I would love to thank a few of my colleagues. Henry Tricks, Energy and Commodities Editor at The Economist, for his amazing help swatting up on solar, and of course Patrick Lane, our banking editor, for his excellent rendition of Fred Bast. I'd also love to thank Edwin Vermulst, who has been super helpful on European solar issues.
And I'd like to thank Professor Meredith Crowley at the University of Cambridge for sharing her research on solar policies around the world, including Chinese industrial policy, but also the European Union's anti-dumping tariffs.
That is all from Trade Talks. Please do leave us a review on iTunes, we'd really appreciate it, and tell your friends, your not friends, just people on the street who you think might like it. If you have any specific feedback or ideas for future episodes, then do get in touch. I'm at Soumaya Keynes.
And I'm at Chad Bown.
And we are on @trade__talks.
That's not one, but 2 underscores. So @trade__talks. Because when it comes to stopping imports of solar panels, and unfortunately climate mitigation progress, one set of U.S. trade remedies just wasn't enough.
Yeah, I don't know how much Fred Bast paid us for his ad, but it was too much.